Welcome to the Honest Psychologist podcast, where two licensed clinical psychologists have joined the chat. I'm Dr. Whitney Graff.
I'm Dr. Paige Hover. We bring our years of expertise to the conversations you're already having, breaking down the topics shaping culture, social media, and everyday life.
No psychobabble, just relatable discussions about how our minds work and why it matters. Good morning. Good morning, Paige.
Good morning.
I'm very excited because we are doing our very first interview today.
Yes.
So
this a little different today.
Yeah, I'm excited. It ought to be interesting. So we have Dr. Stephanie Nelson with us today. I know Stephanie from doing some professional development and consultation with her, mainly because she's a psychology polymath, in my opinion. She is a know-it-all, but in the best way. So if you need to know something about psychology and you ask Stephanie, she'll come back at you with like, well, 75% of people report this. And you'll be like, where did you get that from? So by way of official biography, she's board certified, because she's an overachiever in both clinical neuropsychology and pediatric neuropsychology, and is currently sitting as the president of the American Academy of Pediatric Neuropsychology. This is a big get for our tiny podcast, okay? She has a private practice, Skylight Neuropsychology, and also advises us psychologists as the peer consult, is what it's called, for consultation for other professionals. So welcome, Dr. Stephanie.
I'm so excited to be here.
Thanks for coming.
All right. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about autism. So it's a popular topic across social media, across media, and things like that. So we're going to dive into a bit more of that.
Yeah, I know some adults now are concerned that they might be autistic and they might be seeking an assessment for autism, or they might be coming back from an assessment for autism. And so kind of in the same vein as our episode, if it's not ADHD, what could it be? We thought we would talk about, if you are told that you don't have autism, another way to understand that feedback, or if you're just generally getting that feedback that you might not be autistic, what are some other things that can look like it?
All right. So let's see. We talked about a couple different topics before. Is there anything that you'd like to start with, Stephanie, just to kind of kick us off, or anything that comes to mind when we first kind of pose this question to you?
I wonder if it might be helpful to maybe think through a couple of different lenses that we can look at people's behavior through. If you think about maybe some of our old diagnostic textbooks, they talk about sort of 4 or 5 different lenses that you can look at people through. And maybe I'll just sort of introduce those really quickly, and then we can maybe talk through each one and
great.
Discuss what comes up when we think about those. So I think the main lens, when you go for an evaluation, the main lens that you're thinking of and that your clinician might be thinking of is the diagnostic lens. What diagnosis do I have? What combination of letters or thing in the DSM am I going to come out with? And we can sort of talk about some of the other diagnoses that might fall under what comes up when you go for an autism evaluation, and perhaps the answer isn't that, and you're given some other diagnosis. But there are other ways to look at behavior as well. So another one would be the dimensional lens, more like, what kind of person am I? What sort of temperament do I have? What sort of personality do I have? What traits are maybe an uncomfortable fit for my environment or my family or my spouse or my workplace, things like that. And then there's the narrative lens, like, what has happened to you? What has made you the way you are? What's your story? How do you relate to the world, and how has that happened for you? So we could maybe talk about some things that fit under there. And then the last lens that comes up in diagnostic textbooks is the behavioral lens. What am I doing or not doing in relationships that might be leading to the outcomes that I'm getting, or what things am I avoiding? How am I maybe creating some of my own challenges, or how am I not meeting the challenge that I want to meet in a way that gets me towards my goal? And then I
Mhm.
think the last lens we could talk about is like just modern life, just how hard it is to be a human right now and
So
how
true.
difficult it is to present socially, right? So I wondered if that frame, if maybe we could kind of
I
start with what
love it.
other diagnoses might it be first.
Yeah.
Does that
Okay.
make
Yeah.
sense? And then sort of
Yeah.
work through the rest of those lenses?
Yes,
Agreed.
please.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's
So
start with diagnosis.
yeah,
Go ahead.
have you guys had that where you do an evaluation for autism, or you've had a therapy client who has gone and gotten a an evaluation for autism, and then it just sort of, the report might come back and say doesn't meet criteria for autism, but doesn't necessarily say what it is, or it gives a diagnosis that maybe the person wasn't expecting?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
what types of diagnoses come up instead, if anything is listed in the report for you guys?
Anxiety.
Yeah.
Anxiety. Yeah, I was thinking
Yeah.
social anxiety comes up a lot, anxiety in general. Um, I'll see some of
Depression.
the,
Hmm.
oh, what are the other ones? It's not autism, but it's like the other specified stuff, like where there's like, why am I blanking on those?
Well, we don't have like uh NOS anymore, but we used to
Right,
see
we used
that.
to. Yeah,
Yeah.
you used to see
Right,
a lot of pervasive developmental disorder, NOS, not otherwise specified. They put it as,
right.
right? Yeah. But the
And then I've
research
also,
says it's social anxiety, right? That's the most common reason that someone is mistakenly diagnosed with autism, or someone goes for an autism evaluation and that's not the outcome that they end up with. The
yeah.
research says that social anxiety is the big one, right?
That
Do you see
tracks with
nonverbal
what I've
learning?
seen. Go ahead,
Oh,
sorry.
go ahead, Whitney.
I was just going to say that tracks with what I've seen just because um, the feeling of going into social situations with dread or with tension makes you kind of like um, close up. And so you probably don't look like you probably don't show as much emotion on your face. And so you look more closed off to other people. You might be harder to connect with
Hmm.
because you are kind of like braced and tense. And so another person might sort of say, like, oh, that could look like autism because of that difficulty forming the connection. And it's all kind of part of the way you go into a situation with
Hmm.
that sense of, you know, tension and fear.
Hmm.
Right. And you feel like you're performing when you're in those social situations. You feel like the stakes are very high, so you need to be on your perhaps best social behavior, or at least not make any mistakes. And you might be reluctant or uncomfortable making eye contact that signals I'm available for this social connection. You're probably exhausted by the end of a social situation. You
That's true.
probably feel a heightened sense of sensitivity, like your whole body is almost on fire, or a raw nerve or something like that when you're in those situations.
Can I out
Absolutely.
myself with this? Like,
Hmm.
as like I have a little touch of this, and I will go back after the social situation and think, how did I come across? Did I say the wrong thing? Was that too much? And then because I've got that personality that's like, okay, I'll just dig deep and do it better next time. Then the next time I'm thinking, how
Hmm.
am I coming across? Am I using my hand gestures correctly? Because I am so overly aware. So if you ask me questions about, like, are you changing your behavior to try to fit what you think people expect? Yeah, I am. And just because of that, like, perfectionism and self-criticism.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Right. And social anxiety is one of our more common disorders. Something about 13% of people meet criteria for it at some point in their life. And it's because we evolved to be a very socially related species. We're very interdependent on other people. Even if you are, like me, the most introverted of introverts and think I could go a whole week without talking to anyone perfectly comfortably, I still need other people, and I still worry about how they perceive me and how I come across to them. And it's because when we evolved, we evolved where if you weren't accepted by your group, that wasn't just sad or disappointing. That was dangerous. That meant you
Hmm.
didn't have someone to take care of you if you got sick, or you didn't have reliable trading partners, or you didn't have people who were on your side in a dispute in your village. It was really critical. And so our brains have whole circuits that keep track of how other people perceive us. And that's all they do. Those programs are running all of the time. And it can be really exhausting. It can be really overwhelming. And it also is something that is a big part of just being human for a lot of people
Yeah. The exhaustion piece is something that I was thinking about when you were talking
that
about
you
that. I
relate
think,
to.
well, somewhat. I definitely identify a bit more as an extrovert, so I tend to
Hmm.
feel energized by that stuff. But I think
Yeah.
I hear it a lot talking to clients of the kind of exhaustion, the mental hoops that you're going through before, during, and after. And
Hmm.
then the way that exhaustion plays on our bodies and how we are going to feel more sensory, like irritation, when we're tired. It's not a blanket statement, but I mean, gosh, the tag on the back of your shirt is really going to be annoying when you're exhausted, or
Hmm.
things like that, or the overwhelming noises around you, or things like that, like how that is something that can contribute to that, kind of playing into like how exhausted are you feeling from this, because I think there's the social piece that people think a lot about when they think about with autism, but I think there's also the sensory piece where it's like, wait a second, this is overwhelming me. My environment's really too much right now. And I think that sometimes when we're really amped and nervous and tired, that stuff can really amplify a lot.
Right. Social anxiety, like many of the other disorders in the DSM, is a whole body, whole brain, whole experience. And sometimes when you see it talked about on social media, it seems like people are saying that autism is a whole body, whole brain experience, and these other disorders are your fault and you can do something about them and
What's
you
that
just need to
about?
man up. I'm not sure. I think maybe a lot of people have been told that anxiety or depression or other challenges that you struggle with are maybe those have been downplayed a little bit, or there's a little bit of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or just go to therapy for 8 weeks and get over it sort of thing, maybe. And a lot of people feel that's not their experience of having those conditions or having those differences or having those ways of walking through the world. And I think they're looking for something that says, that captures the whole experience of it. And it feels like autism is the answer right now for capturing that. But if you have been socially anxious or you have been depressed, where you're crushingly lonely and crushingly afraid to trust other people and feeling like it's going to lead to a disappointment at any moment, you know, those are not small things. Those
Mm-mm.
are not easily overcomable or just something you can put aside for the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
100%.
sure. I think that ADHD sometimes gets lumped into that too, of this kind of, same way that autism is like, this whole
Right.
brain, whole body kind of thing. And it's separate from these other, like where we're classifying anxiety and depression as these kind of, I don't know, something you can control kind of
Hmm.
thing, versus I think when there's this idea of it being not something you can control, it feels different.
Right. Even though the research shows that they're also genetically loaded and they're also environmentally influenced and they're also associated with structural brain differences. Whether you have social anxiety or whether you have one of those neurodiverse conditions, they're really similar in terms of all of the associated correlates of them. So I'm not sure why we have that bifurcation in how we talk
Yeah.
about them.
I'm not sure either. I see like a real disappointment when I think there's that
Hmm.
conclusion of like, it's not autism, but I think it is social anxiety. I think there's this like I can see people have like a heavy
Hmm.
reaction to that of just like, oh no. And I try to talk to them, and I think a lot of times it's hard to process a lot in that moment. And so I've never gotten like a really clear answer, but I see disappointment a lot.
Hmm.
Well,
Right.
you know what I think? I think this actually segues us perfectly into lens number two, because
Hmm.
the idea that having, let's say, an anxiety disorder is sort of not a permanent condition, that it is a condition that has treatment available and could alleviate over time. But like if we segue into lens number two, which is the sort of like personality, temperament, kind of
Hmm.
trait lens, we see that there are going to be parts of you that even with treatment, you're not going to turn into a whole different type of person who's now the
Hmm.
life of the party and never wants to go home.
Right. Right. So introversion being those temperamental factors that people have or don't have necessarily a lot of. In the research is actually extroversion, right? You're either an extrovert or you're sort of an not an
Oh,
ambivert
really?
or an introvert. Yeah. And extroverts get energy from social interaction. They do need their downtime, but they get a lot of energy from social interaction. But they're also it's highly correlated with enthusiasm and optimism and energy. And for those of us who are a little bit less optimistic and a little bit less energetic and a little bit less comfortable with social interactions, that's a common one that I think is getting maybe diagnosed as a difference when it really might just be a natural temperamental variation that doesn't necessarily fit with the image that we have of the typical American who is outgoing and energetic and can do and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
introversion would be one of those. Do you have clients that you've noticed who are introverted and maybe don't necessarily know that about themselves or feel like there's something wrong with them because of that?
I see more the second that it's hard to accept that that's the case, and
Hmm.
I think that there's a lot of people want to put forth a lot of effort. I think there's a lot of the hardworking American that is enthusiastic, who's always going for things. And then when it's like, well, I'm tired or I don't want to do these things, I work with people a lot around burnout. And so it's like, well, I have to go to this social event after
Hmm.
work because I have to do this and that'll help me progress in this career and all this other stuff. But I just don't have the energy and I'm so lazy. And they start to like really turn on themselves and really judge themselves a lot when it's like, what if we were just allowing that to be okay? What if we worked with that? You can still be successful in your job without having to do that. But I think there is this idea that really is associated with kind of the preferred, it's like this
Hmm.
almost this extroversion I think was preferred for a long time. And it almost seems like introversion is kind of making a comeback. And it's like, nope, like we're here, we want to be seen, this is who we are. And so I think that maybe that's more what we're seeing today, but it's hard for people to accept sometimes.
Right. We have set up a world in a fairly extroverted way. If you think about a typical classroom that a child is in, they're almost never given any alone time or downtime. It is all about interacting with your peers and often with the teacher present. And a lot of workplaces can be set up that way as well, that there's now an open floor plan, or you're constantly on the floor because you're a cashier and you're interacting with people all of the time or something like that. And even if you do have your own office and have a space to retreat, you are sort of expected to network and to be on LinkedIn and to be out there working on your communication skills and all of that. And so a lot of introverts can feel like there's something wrong with them,
Yeah.
at least some of the time. That's
Mhm.
certainly how I felt growing up in my family, where I was the introvert and there maybe wasn't the expectation of how that was. And I see that coming in sometimes as well, where a very extroverted mom and dad will bring in their introvert child and be like, what's happening here?
Yes.
I
Yeah.
see this other dimension really, I think, represented a lot in kind of more media, this
Hmm.
idea of like this personality trait or the temperament. And I think that that's maybe where, as clinicians, when they come in and they're looking for a diagnosis and it doesn't quite fit all the way, but we can certainly see, like, okay, I can see why you thought that. I can see some
Hmm.
things that relate, when the data doesn't support that diagnosis. And in many ways, maybe they're not experiencing negative impacts on their life. And we try to explain that to them. I think that that's where the two are not blending, where it's like
Mhm.
dimension two is trying to communicate with dimension one. And it's like, well, what if we thought about it in dimension two? And it's like, I think that's hard because it's like, well, can't you just give me a diagnosis? Can't you just be clear about it? And it's like, but it's like two different things communicating.
Right. That line between when are you just an extreme introvert, just sort of on the normal end of the bell curve,
Mm-hmm.
and when does it bleed over into a diagnosis, a personality disorder diagnosis, like, or a autism diagnosis or some other type of diagnosis. We haven't really decided that as a field yet. We sort
No.
of rely on that functional impairment piece. For me, it's that I'm an extreme introvert, but I can do this sort of thing. I can interact. And when you get me with one person one-on-one, you can't shut me up, right? I look like an extrovert in that one situation. And so you can sort of see like, oh, it's not pervasive. It really does depend a lot on finding the environment that is the perfect fit for Stephanie. And that can make a huge difference. But in some situations, I do look impaired. I do look like I am having challenges in those situations. And that line is blurry, right?
Yeah.
Well, and I think we
Yeah.
also haven't mentioned how, because there's five, what we think of five major
Mm-hmm.
personality dimensions, but you had mentioned a few of them together. So I feel like if you go beyond introversion, but you also add in not being
Mm-hmm.
really open to new experience, you're a person who likes
Absolutely.
the things that you're familiar with, and you're not
Mm-hmm.
really spontaneous and adventurous, that you want to go out and see a bunch of new things. You're on the other end of openness to experience. You like it
Right.
predictable and familiar. So you combine that with some introversion.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe a bit of what has been termed neuroticism, which is kind of a propensity to feel that little extra sense of anxiety and things like that, or worry. You add those things together. And I don't know exactly why, like why it's not satisfactory. Maybe because we just don't speak in these terms in the common, discussion enough. But to say
Right.
like that is a way that people are, and that might go together
Right.
more
That
often.
neuroticism one in particular, neuroticism has a horrible name because it sounds again like it's a judgment, like you're neurotic, you're dramatic. But neuroticism, it's sometimes been framed as sensitivity, like the highly sensitive person who just takes in so much information and has it influence their emotions or their body, their experience walking through the world. I tend to think of it like emotional weather, right? Do you live somewhere that's pretty temperate, pretty chill, pretty sunny most days? Or do you have a personality where a lot of days there's rain and some days there's storms and some days it's sunny, but it kind of comes out of nowhere. And some days it's sunny in the morning and then a huge storm rolls in, right? Where it's again not something that you necessarily have control over. It's a part of how your nervous system was built, a part of how you go through the world. But we expect Americans to have that sunny, casual, cool temperament where everything's the same all the time or everything's predictable. And for people who have more emotional weather, who are more highly sensitive people, which is probably 15 to 20% of the population, and in some estimates up to 30% of the population, which is a lot more than people who have autism, right? If we do the math there. I think
Right.
it can be really hard for those individuals to feel like their way of going through the world is valid and common, even if it's not the dominant mode, and that there's not something wrong with them because they have more emotional weather.
Because it
Mm-hmm.
evolved, because it's adaptable. Like
Hmm.
when you form a community of people, you need different types of people in the community. You need some people who are really open to new experience and sunny and not very flappable. And then you
Right,
need other people who are going to be, but what about this? But what about that? Because that can warn the whole community, oh, there could be something coming. And everybody's
right.
bringing something to the picnic.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. They're the people who stand up against injustice. They're the people who care for the vulnerable. They're the people who say, oh, wait, where we're going here isn't right. Or let's look out for possible problems that could happen. We need people with different emotional weather, the same way we need a country where there's lots of different places that you could live that all have different kind of weather that grows different environments.
And I think about it in the workforce too, of like, I think that this idea of being highly sensitive in at work or, don't bring
Mhm.
emotions to work, like you need those, emotions tell you things. And
Right.
maybe if somebody is overwhelmed and crying, it's like, oh, hey, maybe this project is a little like unreasonable or the deadline
Mhm.
might need to be changed because like, hey, this is really stressing people out, so it
Right.
tells people that. But, I was also thinking as we were talking, I wonder somehow if we've gotten to this because I think a lot about, I've done a lot of testing for accommodations and especially in the workforce, it's really hard to get accommodations
Yes.
unless you have some kind of diagnosis. And so I
Mhm.
think that when you're looking at this, like workforces don't necessarily want to recognize that stuff without a diagnosis. And it's like, okay, if you want accommodations, then I need to have some proof, right? And so then we go and we look for this proof. And then sometimes the proof is like this second dimension that we're talking about, and the diagnosis isn't there. And then they can't get their needs met, like they can't get those accommodations that they might need that are totally reasonable to ask. Like, hey, I'm overwhelmed easily. I need to not sit in this big open environment or any other reason, if it doesn't come down to a diagnosis, it seems like it doesn't happen. So I see how sometimes that is like the crux of it. And it's like, okay, well, now what?
Paige, that is such a good point. When we were talking earlier about why does it sometimes seem like people are disappointed when they don't get the diagnosis that they expect, I think part of what they're hearing is that you will not necessarily be taken seriously. Your problem won't be met by your environment. You will have a harder time advocating for your needs, standing up and saying, I need noise canceling headphones or I will not get through the day, if you don't have a specific combination of letters on a piece of paper that someone wrote for you, that you can't just go in and say, you know what, I am a highly sensitive person. It brings a lot to this environment, but also I need this, this, and this. It's a lot harder to make that argument. So that also might be some of people's disappointment.
Yeah, or kind of feeling like the categories of depression or anxiety are so personalized or why
Hmm.
can't I make it work? And it's like, well, that actually is really relevant. I found it was always really hard. Always tried my best to help people get accommodations for things like anxiety because they would, those were the questions that would come to me. I think I have ADHD, I think I have autism. And, if the answer was anxiety, I'd still try to make sure to help them get those accommodations. But it was a lot harder because whether the school or the standardized test or things like that, they were much less accommodating for things like anxiety and depression that absolutely have an impact, but
Hmm.
they just don't see it quite the same way.
Right. We have done such a great job of advocating for people who have different nervous systems in terms of neurodiversity, but maybe we haven't done enough to advocate for just human diversity, just the fact that we're all different and have different needs. And statistically, there is at least one way that every person listening right now is unique, is
Yeah.
different, is on one end of the bell curve, probably multiple areas, right? You might be a high introvert and very sensitive, and or you might be really, really extroverted and really, really sensitive, right?
Hmm.
But there are probably some ways that you are on the edge of the bell curve that we haven't talked enough, maybe as a society, about how to honor that level of diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes me sad too that we
Hmm.
can't just allow someone to wear noise canceling headphones without
Sure.
paperwork that seems like a
Right.
small or wear I've seen requests to wear sunglasses, because the office lighting
Fluorescent
is very
lights.
Right.
bright,
Fluorescent lights, which
and
are the worst, right?
yeah, and like why do we need to work so hard? Why can't we just say like wear them? It's
Hmm.
fine.
Right, right. Well, ever since we developed the American model of manufacturing, like with Henry Ford, where every part had to be exactly the same, now we want every worker to be exactly the same, right? We
Yeah.
don't want to make the job fit them. We want to make them fit the job. And that has left a lot of people feeling like, gosh, I do not fit into this round hole because I am not just a square peg. I am like a spiky diamond shape, and they
Right.
just don't fit in there, right?
Well, and I think that the pandemic was sometimes refreshing for people
Hmm.
to see like to see the different work styles and things like
Hmm.
that and hybrid models and things like that. And I still to this day am still so shocked to see everybody pushing back to go back to the way it was pre-pandemic. I'm like, guys, I'm pretty sure productivity is up when people are flexible or when they can do things that they need to take care of themselves that you don't have to accommodate. Like if you offer a hybrid work schedule, you don't have to make all these accommodations. People can work with themselves to kind of do that. But oh man, sometimes there's just this like really rigid hold on these old ways. And it's like, guys, we have evidence that it worked actually pretty well in a lot of ways. So,
I'd love to see the data on that. I wonder.
yeah.
Do we know?
I think it's conflated because there were so many overlapping things. Obviously, the stress was high. There was all sorts of things, but I think that there are certain elements as far as like satisfaction, like workplace satisfaction with flexibility. I think that attendance did go like issues went down as far as kind of issues with that because, people were able to take I mean, gosh, they were able to take a doctor's appointment in the middle of the day, and telehealth exploded with the pandemic, so they could do it from their home. So like just making things like easier to achieve, but obviously a significant amount of stress was happening and other changes that were really difficult. So I think it's hard to tease out.
And it's such a balance, right? Because we do want accommodations for people, but we also want to make sure they're not just necessarily like avoiding
Right.
or interacting less or developing those social muscles less.
Yes.
So the hybrid, for example, or online was a disaster for school children, right?
Right.
They seem to need that interaction, even if they are really introverted or even if they are really sensitive. They seem to at least need some degree. Maybe not the whole school day or the whole school day as it currently is, but if anybody had a child at home during the pandemic,
Yes. Yeah. I was gonna say that's the big
right,
asterisk on that. I knew
right.
that.
So we have to find that balance where we honor people's differences and help them feel comfortable walking through the world, but we don't encourage avoidance or not trying hard things or not developing muscles that really need to be developed through interaction. That's a tricky balance too.
Like the distress tolerance muscle that
Mhm.
still needs to be built up and, kind of maintained.
Well,
Mhm.
I think I heard a lot of people say like my social, like my, like almost like my social muscle got weak remember
Absolutely.
when we first started going to restaurants again and like seeing our friends, we were like, oh, hello.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Well,
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
we hit which was the lens where it was person, environment, fit? Was that 3 or 4?
That's sort of uh, maybe a little bit we're getting into that fourth lens, that behavioral lens, that lens of what you're doing, what you're not doing, that is maybe shaping how you go through the world. And so experiential avoidance, I know, Paige, at least you do ACT, right?
Yeah.
Where
Whitney does too.
Winnie does too. Okay. Where when you avoid things, it can end up making things harder when you need to do it eventually, or it can lead you into a narrative of, I can't do that, rather than just, it makes me uncomfortable to do that. And then you walk into that situation in that defensive pose, in that way that right? Uh, uh, I think, Whitney, I heard you say on a previous podcast, like loneliness begets loneliness, right? Like when you go into a situation in a way that you are signaling, I wish I wasn't in this situation. I wish I could avoid it. I feel lonely. I feel like nobody's going to like me. Then you can give off that vibe, which other people might then treat you in a particular way that actually has nothing to do with your true level of social skill or your true personality. It can be more about what you're doing in that moment.
And then you can experience that, internalize that, and then it can perpetuate, or it can be self-fulfilling prophecy, or it can be these long-standing patterns of behavior that you look back and
Mhm.
you go, it must be this because
Right.
like it's been like this. But when you tease it out, like you were saying, it's so hard to compare, like, wait, which one is it?
Hmm. Right.
And go ahead.
We've really developed, I think, this idea that people are supposed to have perfect social skills, I guess from birth, and that they don't develop through interaction and through going to a situation and being awkward and strange and uncomfortable and your unique, interesting self, and then getting feedback afterwards and reflecting on it and saying, oh, I think next time I'm going to sort of do this, or getting modeling and imitating other people or getting advice from other people and changing your social behavior. I think one of the most helpful things that anyone ever told me when I was a introvert as a kid and much more socially awkward because of that is someone said, when you go to a party or something like that, you could get out of your own head and look for the other introverts and go over and approach them and make sure they're feeling comfortable and see if there's anything else that you could do in those moments to make their experience better. And for some reason, that had never occurred to me. I thought that you just either went to a party and were extroverted and having a great time and knew how to do it, or you were like me and didn't know how. And the idea of this third way of behaving had literally never occurred to me. I think I had that belief that we all have as a society right now that social skills are something you either just have or don't.
Hmm.
And I didn't have them. So that was my belief about myself. And I was behaving that way. And it turned out that there was this whole other option available to me that I hadn't thought of.
Yeah. It makes me think of Whitney when we were talking about the ADHD episode and we talked about executive functioning, how there
Mhm.
is oftentimes this assumption that you should just know how to do things. And it's like, no,
Right.
executive functioning develops by struggling
Develops.
and failing and then learning, oh, wait, that didn't work. But there's a lot of this expectation that this should not be hard. And if it's hard, it must be a problem. It's like,
Right.
no, but that's the part of the process. You have to make mistakes. You have to get messy, as Miss Frizzle would say. Like all those good
I
things.
love that.
Maybe that's the message we need to remind people to watch Magic School Bus.
Right?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
I miss Magic School Bus. We've been in this era of putting our best life online,
Mm,
showing our best angles to the camera. And even if you were somebody who didn't post yourself to Instagram constantly in front of a certain shade of pink wall, you still got this sense that everybody else was doing it effortlessly.
mhm. Right. We all put our highlight reel on Instagram or social media, even if just in our heads, even if we don't actually post it. I am constantly walking around thinking in some way, like I'm sort of being observed, like there's an audience. Like it's
Oh, for
hard in the
sure.
age of social media to not feel that way. And you're sort of allowed to go on social media and say, oh, I feel really anxious or I am neurodiverse, but we don't put our mistakes on social media like, I was unkind today, or I thought a lot about myself and dominated conversations where I just talked about my problems, or
Mhm.
I didn't do, I had the opportunity to be of service to someone else and I chose not to. We don't
Mhm.
put those kinds of mistakes on social media. We don't put those normal human messinesses out there. And so when we find ourselves being unkind or overly self-focused or not doing the things that we want to do, we can feel like we're the only ones and
Mhm.
we want permission or a reason for that. And sometimes I think we might turn to a diagnosis to be given that permission.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Or
I
I
mean,
also go ahead,
I was just
Whitney.
going to
Go.
say the internet is such a punishing place.
Uh, yes,
That if you do screw up in a really just normal, authentic human way, the way we all screw up, sometimes the
you're
dog
just
pile.
cringe. Yeah,
Yeah, and you can really get piled on. And so
absolutely.
having something that sort of says, "Hey, don't be so harsh to me."
Hmm.
I have this thing that says that I'm allowed to be different. I'm allowed to make mistakes. I mean, I want that. I don't want to be piled on. I want to be treated kindly in my humanity,
Yeah.
which is to
Yeah.
say I'm gonna say the wrong thing. I'm gonna make mistakes. And um, yeah.
And that's
Oh,
kind of what I was thinking. What I was going to
mhm.
say is I think that when we do see it on the internet, it's in a big way, or it's in, like you were saying, Whitney, like, hey, there's this thing, please be nice to me. That it's like, I see it in kind of like a burnout moment where it's just like my
Hmm.
mental health is so much, and this is why I've been acting this way. Or if you saw this, it was because I was so anxious. It has to be big. So it's always kind of that emphasis on a really intense kind of moment rather than those everyday moments that are always there. Like, gosh, I had one today. I had one yesterday. Like they're there every single
They're
day.
they're there all the time, right? And then if you do get piled on to whether it happens in real life or it happens on social media, that sort of leads us into that narrative lens of looking through like what happened to you? Were
Mm.
there things that made you not necessarily able to trust other people or worried that social mistakes are going to be deeply punished or feeling like you need to go through the world in an even more sensitive way than you would normally because you're constantly worried about actual things actual traumas or actual experiences that you've had that you don't want to happen again. So that narrative lens where you see people who either the way they have been raised has led to maybe an attachment difference where they maybe have an anxious attachment style or an avoidant attachment style where they don't fundamentally trust that other people will see them and value them and meet them where they're at. Or maybe they've gone through like a bullying experience at school or something like that, and it has changed how they walk through the world, how they interact through the world on a fundamental neurobiological, again, level, right?
Say more when you say a neurobiological level. What do you mean?
Well, when we think about something like neurodiversity, those conditions are associated with differences in how the brain works. But if you look at someone who has been through a traumatic experience, or when you look at people with different attachment styles, they also have brains that work differently than their brains would have worked if they hadn't gone through those exact same experiences. So they may have networks that are devoted to watching out for, like keeping themselves safe, that are overly active. And when your network is focused on keeping you safe, it takes away from the networks that help you pay attention to tasks or help you feel comfortable and confident. Those networks are anti-correlated. If you're worried about your safety, your brain does not care about paying attention or filling out forms or being comfortable and confident. It is just in this place of noticing every little detail that is happening and trying to keep you safe. And we can see that on brain scans. So it really is a neurobiological difference. It's just one that has been developed after you were born rather than before you were born.
Right. And so you might even be born with like a certain temperament,
Hmm.
maybe
Right.
like more of a tendency towards like how you process fear, and then you're in your environment. And so you're saying the experiences that you have just going through the world, even non-traumatic, but just common experiences like being excluded or
Hmm.
um just
Exactly.
general
People
bad
with
experiences.
more of that emotional weather, people who are more sensitive, for example, are more likely to develop PTSD after a trauma, for example, because they might be taking so much of it in and it might influence their neurobiology even more than someone who is just kind of calm and chill all of the time. People who are more introverted are more likely to develop sort of an avoidant attachment if they have a environment that suggests you should be independent. And an introvert like me, who also, has one toe over into avoidant attachment, you should be self-reliant. And I was like, great, I could be by myself. Sure, absolutely. And so I was more predisposed to develop that way of relating to the world and that way of my brain functioning in social situations. Absolutely. So that's why these lenses are complementary. Like they're different angles of looking at the person. It's not just do you have a diagnosis or is it your behavior and it's your fault? It's more like, maybe you have something that's diagnosable, but you definitely have a personality and you definitely have had experiences that have shaped who you are. And you're definitely also doing things out in the world that may or may not be leading towards the goals that you have for yourself that maybe worked when you were a kid, but aren't working now, or maybe work in some situations, but not others, or they're the only ones you know, and you haven't thought of these other ways of behaving. You have all of these things all at the same time, and then they interact.
And I think that this is a really wonderful way for listeners to kind of understand. I've heard the question a lot of like, well, why is it so hard to diagnose autism? And it's like,
Yes.
this,
Right.
this, all
I
this.
I think psychologists are bad at diagnosing. I think we actually are quite good at mapping the terrain of a problem. When you have a therapy client, for example, your brain is naturally doing this as a psychologist. You are thinking through all of the different ways that this problem shows up, and you're looking at it through all of these different lenses simultaneously, and you're creating this rich picture of the person. And then we have the DSM, which is very flat, very one-dimensional, and probably very wrong. It's like we're very good at mapping the terrain of a person's inner psychology, but then the name of the countries on the map is from
Yeah.
like the 1400s. Right? It's like, oh, we know exactly where they are, latitude and longitude, and whether they're on an island, and what the topography is like, and how they got there. And we think they're in the New World when they're actually over in this completely different part of the, right? And this is why it's so hard, is that I don't think our diagnoses have caught up with our ability to create these rich three-dimensional pictures yet.
Right. Yeah, I've had people in feedback sessions be like, well, wait, do I have it or do I not?
Right.
And I'm trying to explain this kind of
Right.
rich kind of experience. And it's like, I've heard people joke about it. I've heard people on social media there was a comedian that was like, yeah, they don't know if I have autism or not. And I was like, there's
Yeah.
probably so much to that. Like, I get that. But I think for their experience, it's like, is it a yes or is it a no? And it's like, and psychologists were really good at not answering a question directly, but it's not like we're avoiding it. It's just, there's a lot to know.
Right. Right. Yeah.
All right. So we've gotten four dimensions. What was the fifth?
My fifth one is modern life. Just how
Oh,
hard it is to be a human right now. We were talking a little bit about social media, and one of the things that social media does, for example, is you have to be this sort of consistent brand all of the time that is immediately legible to everyone. When you post something on Instagram or whatever social media you're on, it has to be understandable to your employer and your grandma who's also following you, and your ex who you wish would stop following you, and that cute guy at the gym, and your frenemies. And right, like it has to be this consistent, clear message of who you are. And not only are none of us that, none of us are this perfect, coherent, cohesive way of interacting through the world, but then it's also supposed to be a good, like it's supposed to be a perfect way of getting through the world, and it has to work for everyone in every situation. And keeping that up is impossible and exhausting and hard. And so I think the most common thing that people, adults especially, come in with when they are coming in for an evaluation is, why am I so tired all the time? Why does everything feel like it takes so much effort? Why am I kind of sad and angry every moment, right? And they're trying to understand that. And I think a big part of it is it's not just social media, but that's one of the ways that we can talk about how modern life has changed what we all have to do and how we all have to present ourselves in ways that are really uncomfortable to carry around.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're saying that, it occurs to me that I think that we think about ourselves more now than
Hmm.
maybe people have in the past,
Hmm. And
and
we're encouraged to,
yeah.
right?
And
Um,
we have the time to, we have the available resources to kind of sit and think, who am I? Why am I like this? Because we're not like, I'm not
right. And we don't really have brains that were designed for that much self-examination. I saw it was probably a TikTok or something recently where they were talking about why do you hate your reflection when you look in the mirror, right? We all look in the mirror, we all are like, no,
Mhm.
that isn't what I was hoping it would look back at me. And it's because we don't have brains that were designed to look at ourselves all of the time. We didn't evolve with mirrors. You could kind of see your reflection every now and then in some water, and it was kind of blurry, and you sort of like,
Oh my
oh, okay, right?
God.
And you could
Wow.
very rarely see it. And you weren't meant to see yourself from every angle all of the time, constantly in your face. And that's true socially and emotionally, and in terms of our personality as well. We weren't really meant to do this much self-examination and to be thinking about how we present this much to this many people all of the time. It's
Yeah. It's something I'm thinking a lot about lately because
Mhm,
sometimes, like we've mentioned like a skill like opposite to emotion action all the time,
mhm,
right? It's our
mhm,
brand now. But sometimes when I think like when I'm most down, I feel better when I'm directed outward. Like if I'm
right.
of service to someone else and
Mhm,
you know, some part of me is needed somewhere to do a thing, to accomplish a goal with someone else.
right,
And I'm caught up in that, and I don't have the energy in that moment to think about me, to think about my mood and my feelings and why am I like this. I get out of myself and I'm happier.
right.
And it's something I think about all the time because if we're providing treatment, how can we not kind of fan the flames of like a depressed, anxious extra introspection through
Mhm,
talk therapy, you know,
right.
if it's really like my getting out there and doing something that's important and getting out of my head. That's
Mhm.
that's my treatment sometimes.
If you think of all of the non-therapy things that we recommend to clients, getting out in nature, volunteering, being part of a religious community, gratitude journaling, exercise, what they all have in common is getting out of your head, stopping the self-examination, because I think they all have a value. And it's not to say that people shouldn't be living a self-examined life. It's just that we might be doing too much self-examining. If, if you think back to that story that I was telling of how someone taught me to, at a party, to go over to like what worked for going over to the other introverts is it stopped me from ruminating on my situation. It got me out of my head. And that was a better solution for me. And I think that social media and the general media environment and modern life and the isolation that we all feel, that we're all much lonelier and we don't have a village that is helping us raise our children and those types of things, they're all suggesting go inward, ruminate more, fix yourself, figure out what your problems are, figure out why you're like this. And I'm not sure that that's doing us a service.
Yeah, we've talked about that many times of questioning when do we recommend therapy to stop or when do
Hmm.
would we always recommend somebody to be going into therapy? And we're talking about the reasons why we would not. Sometimes it's too much. You got to get
Hmm.
out of your own head and into the world. But I was also thinking as you were describing just like the brand, this
Hmm.
like wide casting net, it kind of helped me understand, I think, why we see maybe on social media, for example, the net of autism and ADHD becoming so wide. Because if you
Yes.
think about one person who's maybe speaking about one experience that they have that might relate to autism, but they're trying to make it this wide net, it then becomes this huge umbrella where it seems like everything is a sign of autism or ADHD when you look at it on social media. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why, because it's this wide casting net that just gets like lumped in that somebody, that we're all trying to portray on this media to lots of different audiences.
Right. You want to talk about your unique experience that's only shared by 1% of the population, but you also need the TikTok to go viral.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Or how you're
Right.
speaking to just like so many, like as you were saying, of like
Yeah.
how you're speaking to the 1% that might get it, but then you also want your grandmother to get it who's watching it,
Hmm.
but also this random, like
Hmm.
just this like, wow, okay, like that's how I think some of this, I don't know, I just had a light
Right.
bulb moment of like, oh, that
Yeah.
kind of makes sense as to why that net has gotten so wide on
Right.
those platforms.
Hmm.
All right.
Absolutely.
I think we did an excellent job here. We covered all of our, I'm just going to pat us on the back. Why not?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think
Anything
that
else? Last thoughts? Go ahead, Pam.
No, I think we did a good job, and also we're messy and awkward and imperfect. And hopefully that is something that the people listening can also relate to and realize that the connection happens through these uncomfortable, strange interactions that are, can actually lead to really cool things. So
Yeah, that's our
Oh,
brand.
I love
I love
that.
it.
Well, we hope that the listeners can take away a little bit more of kind of the thoughts on autism and, kind of why it's so complicated to diagnose and kind of all
Mhm.
the things and factors that we take into account when we're going through an evaluation or considering this diagnosis that hopefully gets people thinking about the different lenses that maybe they're seeing themselves through or some of these concerns that they have. And maybe that adds some clarification for them. Obviously, this is not treatment, but, a little bit more insight.
Thank you for being here, Stephanie.
Thanks for inviting me, you guys. This was fun.
Thanks. Thanks for coming, Stephanie.
All right, till next time, rate and review, please. This podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for treatment of any kind.